Welcome to What the Fuck Just Happened. I'm your host, Liz Enton. If you listen to the intro, you know my story. If not, here's a brief summary. I'm a sciencey-skeptic, and when my dad died, I took a shot in the dark and decided to investigate if there was any possible evidence of an afterlife. I assumed that was as realistic as Santa Claus, but I was desperate. However, I was so blown away by what I discovered that I wrote a book and launched this podcast. In this podcast, I will be talking to some fairly normal people about some really weird shit. I speak with everyone from psychic mediums and afterlife researchers to ordinary people who've had some inexplicable experiences. So come, listen. There's no need to draw any final conclusions. Keep an open mind and wonder, what the fuck just happened? Hi, today I have Simon Bown on. He is host of the Past Lives podcast, and I had a great time being a guest on his podcast as well. He's also a past life regression therapist, and I will let Simon take over and introduce anything else about himself.
Yeah, so I've been producing the Past Lives podcast for a few years now. There's over 260 episodes. Each one is an hour-long interview with somebody who's, got an interest in the afterlife, whether they've had a near-death experience or if it's about children with past life memories or researching mediums. There's so much stuff we've covered. And it's been a real education for me. And also, I have a diploma in clinical hypnotherapy and certified in past life regression therapy. I've done hundreds of sessions. I do them over Zoom. So I have clients all over the world and I do them just about every day. So, it's been a great learning experience doing all this stuff.
All of that's amazing. I guess I'll start by asking you a few questions about your podcast. First of all, not that many of us are so into this, we start podcasts into afterlife evidence. What got you started in the first place?
Well, I suppose it's a fascination with this. And I've had all these experiences all throughout my life. And I had experiences when I was a child, when I was in my 20s. So having these experiences and having a fascination and reading all these books over time, and I had a long commute, and it was maybe 2.5 hours a day going there and back. And so I started listening to podcasts, and there may be 10 or 12 podcasts, and I'd get them all lined up and I'd listen to them in the car all the way. And after a while, I started to think, maybe I could do this, because I've been a musician since I got my first bass guitar in 1980. And over the years, I learned how to record using all the software at home. And so I thought, recording just a voice is a lot easier than recording drums and guitar and bass and vocals and mixing all that together. And because I had some knowledge on this subject, I knew who I wanted to interview and what the subjects I wanted to cover. So there is a slight thing where I called the podcast the Past Lives podcast. And that makes it sound like it's just about reincarnation, but it's not. There's a lot more that I cover there, looking for evidence of an afterlife and all these different things that come together. And also, after a while, I have a great interest in UFOs as well. And I had the occasional guest on my podcast to talk about UFOs. And I thought there's so much more to this. So I started a UFO podcast, and that's called the Alien UFO Podcast. There's 70 episodes there, and that's going strong. And I also produce another episode in the week where I read extracts from books. I get authors' permissions, and those episodes go really as well, the paranormal stories. So I try and produce a lot of information of all this amazing stuff. And after all this time, and it's been so intense since I started doing it for a living, I'm still excited, and I don't get bored of it. And there's always new things to learn. It's just great to do.
So you said that having this podcast has basically been an education for you. What are some of the most exciting, unexpected things that you've learned?
I suppose because one of the things about my podcast is I don't have somebody on as a guest unless they've written a book or they've written something somewhere. And the way I work is I will read the guest's book to find the questions that I want to ask them. And since, like I said, 270 episodes, that's a lot of books. And that's how it's been an education. It's like a college course over these years. And, you know, really finding out about physical mediumship has been really interesting. I didn't think that was a thing anymore. I thought that was 100, years ago that was going on. And also finding so much extensive evidence of children with past life memories where it gets so detailed and the children know so much stuff that they couldn't possibly know anyway. It's not like their parents knew this stuff either. It's just tiny, bizarre facts that they're able to put forward, and it's only after extensive research they find out that that stuff was true. But with physical mediumship, there's a guy called Stuart Alexander in the UK who I've exchanged a few emails with him. I'm trying to sneak myself into one of his seances, but hasn't happened yet. But I talked to Leslie Kane, who is she wrote a book called Surviving Death, and the Netflix series Surviving Death is based on her book. And she's also written stuff about UFOs, and she's a New York Times journalist. And she was at one of his seances, and this stuff sounds like Harry Potter magic in the real world, where they usually have in the physical mediumship seance, the lights are out, but at this point, Stuart Alexander has a red light on so you can see what's happening. And he is sitting in a chair opposite Leslie Kane. And there was this table in between them that's quite a little coffee table with a glass top. So the red light's underneath the table. And Stuart Alexander has got his hands and his feet, they're cable tied to the chair. So he can't take his hands away from where he is, and people can see where his hands are. And this stuff starts appearing on the side of the table where he is. You know, they call it ectoplasm. And she said it was like a mist. And it started coming up over the table, and it was very clear she could see it. And this is all in her book. And the mist started to form into the shape of a human hand, and it completely formed this human hand shape. And then this voice in the room sounded like it was up in the ceiling somewhere, said, "Well, aren't you going to shake my hand?" And she took hold of this hand, and she said it felt just like a human hand, and it had just coalesced out of the mist, and she could feel the flesh and the bones, and she shook hands with it, and she let go of it, and then it kind of dissipated and disappeared. And that's just one of these things that happened in this physical mediumship seance. And there are, people like Penn and Teller who will tell you, oh, it's all a trick. But that's one hell of a trick if you can do that. And so when I was learning about that stuff, that was a surprise for me. And then you find out that there are physical mediums around the world who are doing this stuff. There's a guy called Kai Muga. I don't know if you've heard of him.
I have. I haven't seen him yet. So I'm like you, desperately trying to get into Stuart Alexander's seances too. And Leslie Kean is she's completely trustworthy in terms of not just her integrity but her intelligence and ability to assess. So that she believes this, I've got to see this. There's something to it.
Yeah.
So sorry, go on about Kai. I'd love to hear what you have to say about him.
Yeah, well, there's videos of him on YouTube, so you can look this up, and he produces these crystals from his body, and it looks a bit icky, but there'll be a close up of his face, and there'll be a lump appear here, and he pushes up, and this crystal will come out of his eyelid and fall out, and then he'll do it again, and then he'll do it from this eye, and he'll keep doing it, and there'll be a pile of crystals. And you think, well, a magician might be able to do it with one or two crystals, but a big handful of crystals, where are you going to store that in your face? If it's a trick, how are you going to do it? And people have found much larger crystals around him, and they're sure that crystal wasn't there before. And they look round and it's there and it's the size of your fist or even bigger. And these things materialize around him during his seances. And that's, they call it apports, like kind of objects that teleport into it. So, yeah, I have to see if I can get a sitting with him as well.
I would like to try him too. I've just been to one physical medium seance and it was fraudulent, unfortunately. But I think myself, not at all a physical medium, I bent a spoon and I once heard a voice in the air calling my name. And if that, and I've had one apport. So just explaining apports, those are this phenomena when an object appears seemingly out of nowhere, and it seems to be the thought is it's signs from the other side. There have been apports that have been reported to show up in seances. If you read my book, you read about how there seemed to be an apport of a special feather sign from my dad that was inexplicable, even to me as a super skeptical person. So if that's happened to me, there's got to be an expert who's able to experience this at the next level. Have you ever seen or witnessed physical mediumship yourself in person?
I haven't. I did have one thing happen to me where I was telling you about it before in the emails, this thing with the feathers, where I was talking to a woman on my podcast who'd written a book about angels, and she was saying, "Oh, when they're close by because they leave feathers, these white feathers." And I was, sometimes you interview people and they'll say something, and you think, "Oh, that's a bit too far for me. They're getting a bit too woo or something." And the next day, I'm walking down the road, and this white feather just slowly falls out of the air in front of me. And I thought, "Oh, yeah, it's just a coincidence." And so 3 or 4 weeks later, I'm interviewing a medium, and she's friends with that woman. They co-wrote a book together. And after we finished recording, I was saying to her, I was talking to her about these feathers. And the next day I was walking down the road and this feather just floated down in front of me. And, this medium laughed and said, "Yeah, that, feathers is a thing." And so we finished the call and I go downstairs, and there in the middle of my daughter's bedroom, she's a teenager, is a feather sitting right in the middle of the room on the floor. And she's very neat and tidy, and there was nothing else on the floor. And I said to her, "Where did that come from?" And she looked at it and she was like, "Oh, I don't know," and went back to her video game. So this seemed weird to me. It's a bit of a coincidence. I'd just been talking about feathers showing up, and a feather shows up. So a few months later, I'm at this medium's house and I'm sitting opposite her, and she's in an armchair, I'm in an armchair, and the carpet's completely clean. And for an hour, she gives me a mediumship reading. She was really good, and she came up with some really great stuff. And when it finished, we were just talking, and I was talking about the podcast and this thing with feathers. And then she says, "Oh, look down." And on the floor between us on the carpet, there was a feather. And it's like, where did that come from? It's this thing where my brain just came to a stop. I couldn't work it out because I'd been sitting opposite her a whole hour and that feather was not there. And neither of us had got up and moved and gone anywhere. And just there it was. And so you could say that's an apport. You might say, "Oh, well, you shifted your feet. It was stuck on the bottom of your shoe and it fell off or something." But that exact point I was telling her about feathers appearing, a feather appeared. And it's just that makes you think. And that thing I was saying earlier about how you might talk to somebody and they say something, or you think, "Oh, that's going too far for me, that's too woo." Now this thing with feathers, it makes you think. And I wonder, what is it? because when people on my podcast first started talking about angels, I imagine them in this kind of religious thing where they'd be wearing a white robe and they've had these big wings, maybe playing a harp or something. But now the impression I get from talking to people is that no, they say no, it's angels more like they're spiritual beings. It's not a religious thing. It's like spirit guides. It's something spiritual, and we use the word angel because maybe there isn't a better word for them. But you shouldn't regard them as specifically and only religious.
I think a lot of the language can end up being off-putting. People use language a lot what they're raised in. So when I hear angel, God, I'll maybe dismiss listening to things. And I've learned since studying to listen through this and hear near death experience stories in another light. But I'm fascinated by the feathers because I had a really inexplicable feather apport too. I write about in my book, and um, it was just insane. And so to me, that it seems to be, yeah, when I first heard about feathers too, I was like, oh, come on. So yeah, well, hopefully one day also you and I will both get to see Stuart Alexander. I'm trying to. So you mentioned quite a bit about children with past life memories that you've learned about. I assume you're talking about the work of Dr. Jim Tucker and the previous work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, who since passed away. Is there any specific case that really stands out to you?
Yeah, because I've also talked to Dr. Erlander Haraldson, and he's investigated this. Jim Matlock, he's got a great book out on it, and Carol Bowman, she's done some great stuff. And it was interesting to talk to her and how she got into it because she's a psychologist. I think she's retired now. And she actually is very supportive of parents who have children with past life memories. But she was saying for her, it started with her son. I think they were at a firework display and he was very young and he was really upset by the loud bangs. And he started talking about a life in the Civil War. And he was drawing things like this weird carriage with a gun on it that he couldn't possibly know about. And they did some research and they found a picture of exactly that gun carriage that he had drawn. That he said that this is what he was using in this civil war, and he drew a, a map of the battleground showing where each group of soldiers were from his side and from the enemy side, and they tracked that battlefield down, and his map was correct. And so that's what got her into researching children with past life memories. And even for me, I just once I was in the kitchen, my daughter was 3 4 years old, and she said to me, I used to pick you up when you were this small. And I said to her, pardon? And she was like, well, I didn't say anything. But, there's those other famous cases that Jim Tucker's looked at with James Liniger, the pilot from the Second World War, and how he remembered getting shot down over Iwo Jima in an aircraft. And one of the things that stood out to me with him was that because he talked about flying the Corsair, that was his aircraft, and the parents bought him a model Corsair, and he looked at it and he said, "Oh, they haven't put the aerial on. There was an aerial sticking out the side of the aircraft. We kept walking into it. It was really awkward." And then they did the research and they found out, yes, that aircraft did have an aerial that was sticking out the side, and it was awkward. And he had talked about how he was flying Mustangs, but he was a test pilot. Every time that they would land the aircraft, when they were testing it, the tires would blow out. And so they had to do real deep research to find out. And that was true. That happened with the Mustang when it was being tested. And so how could a 5-year-old know this stuff? And also there's the emotional side of it because the children can become so upset with this stuff. And they say that James Liniger would have nightmares and he'd be screaming in his bed at night, trying to kick his covers off and shouting, something like, small man's burning, he can't get out. Small man's burning, he can't get out. And that was referring to the plane crash when he had died in the past life. And eventually he met the previous lives, the guy, his sister, who was obviously an old lady, and she said there must be something here because he knows too much. He knows something, and she wouldn't sort of say yes, it's definitely reincarnation, but she said something of her brother has come through because he talked about their family as well and the father, how the father would treat them when they were children, and she said there's no way he could know that. I mean, it's not like they had Facebook back in the 40s.
That case was one of the first I read and made such a difference. And from what I've heard, that was the case that convinced Dr. Jim Tucker this was real. And so now you do past life regressions. You're
Yeah.
as a therapist. What got you into that?
Well, I used to go to the College of Psychic Studies in the 1980s in London, and I wasn't a student. I would go and pay a little bit of money because there were students there, students who were learning to be mediums or psychics or channels and learning all sorts of things. Or you could pay a bit more money and then you could sit with one of the teachers. And there was somebody doing past life regression there. So I think it was about 1987 I did my first past life regression when I was taken through. So over the years, I did more and more, and I wanted to do this because I find it so fascinating. And also, it can be very helpful, it can be very healing. So I wanted to do it properly, and I went to college and got the diploma in clinical hypnotherapy, which was a 10-month course. And then after that, I got the certification to do past life regression therapy. And so I learned all the techniques of how hypnosis works, and also all the things like helping people stop smoking and lose weight and phobias and all these different techniques. But with my first past life regression, it was such an impact on me, the way it worked and what I got out of it, that was started me on the path for the hypnosis. And it was a thing with that past life regression. And when I was lying down on my back and this lady was talking me into it. They're doing the hypnotic induction. And then we got to this point where I found myself as a small child in a park in London. And I kind of snuck my eyes open a little bit and I could almost see these little feet where my knees were. And also being in the park as a child with bare feet, I could almost feel the grass between my toes as well. And it was amazing what was coming through there and the emotions. And also being in that park, I was there with that life's mother and father, and there was a pet dog, and there was another child. And the father there, I just recognized him straight off as somebody who's a friend of mine in this life, who's a very close friend of mine. And so those connections can be seen as well. And I see that coming up when I do past life regressions with people, that sometimes I'll ask them, do you recognize this person? And other times they'll just say, hey, I know who that is in my current life. And there was later verification as well, because in that past life regression, I saw a park in London and I saw the house where we lived. And I knew it was 1895. You just know stuff sometimes when you do this. And the park was a bit weird because it was on such a steep slope. And so there's no other park like that, definitely in London. But a couple of years after the regression, I went through a part of North London I'd never been to before. And there was the park exactly as I'd seen it in that past life regression. And also the houses in that area are exactly like the houses that I saw in the past life regression. And I'd never been there before. I couldn't possibly know, what that park looked like. So for me, that was a small kind of verification of the past life. But then it went on to other things and other past life regressions I've had. There's been more verifications that point to these past lives being real. It's not just your imagination.
I would love to hear more about another verifications that you saw because I know, and this is in no way to say definitely that past life regressions should be dismissed at all, but I know just in terms of the hard science being done at University of Virginia, they often have to dismiss them because they're done by adults and they can't prove that people didn't know things, and often they're not verified. I still think they're very worthy of consideration. And
For me, in that life, I was a little girl when I entered that past life, and I went on to be a nurse in the First World War in France. And I went to Google afterwards, a long time afterwards. But one of these things about these past life regressions is these images stay in your mind over the years. And I Googled First World War nurses' uniforms, and it was exactly what I saw. And I had another past life regression where I went to a life which seemed to be in Venice in the 17th century. And I was wearing these shoes that just, I thought surely they don't wear shoes like that then. But I Googled it and I found that they that was the shoes. I found almost exactly the same shoes as the ones I saw in the past life regression. But one thing, talking about somebody else who was a guest on my podcast, this guy called Robert Snow, and he was a detective for 38 years in Philadelphia, and he did a past life regression, and he tracked down the past life. He's a detective, and he had what he called 28 proofs. And the thing was, he did his past life regression before the internet. So he had to do all his research and trying to track down this life, going to libraries and going to museums. But he saw himself as somebody painting, and he became not a very famous artist, but it was a thing where he didn't believe in past life regressions. He didn't want to do it. And somebody at the precinct where he was kept saying to him, "You've got to do this past life regression." And he's like, yeah, it's all a load of rubbish. I'm not doing it. And he said it got to a point where he'd be walking down the corridor and he'd see them coming the other way, and he'd quickly dive into an office so they didn't have to meet them. And he thought to himself, this is getting stupid. I'll do the past life regression. They won't even be able to hypnotize me. It's a load of rubbish. And he got to that point where, part of the past life regression, he found himself standing in front of a painting that he was in the act of painting it, and it was a portrait of a hunchback woman. And that's one of the things he did when he was doing research. He was trying to find that painting, and he just could not find it anywhere. And he was thinking, it's just my imagination. I'm sure I saw that painting somewhere and my brain just put it in there. And he went to New York, and he went to all these places, these museums and libraries, trying to find these books and looking up all these paintings. And it just happened that he was on holiday in New Orleans with his wife, and he went into this small gallery, and he went upstairs to where all the like rubbish paintings were, and there was that painting, the hunchback woman, exactly as he'd seen it in the past life regression. And it was at that gallery that he was able to find out who the artist was. And so that led him down the path to get these 28 proofs of all these different things he saw in the past life regression were proved to have happened to that person in the past life. And so I found that to be a real great one.
I've heard that one, and it wasn't a super famous artist. Like if it was like, oh, I was Van Gogh, that would be obviously a lot more dismissed. So when I heard that one, I thought that was definite evidence that it's not unconscious memories making up a story. And what percent do you think there are some people that are making it up during the past life regressions? Do you think everybody is actually remembering a past life? Especially, I know I did it, but I'm a very creative person and I'll make up stories just for fun for myself all the time. Not as much as a creative writer, but I tend to tell myself stories for fun sometimes, and used to write creative stories just as a kid. So, to what extent do you think people are telling themselves stories versus genuinely having a past life regression?
Well, when I was in training, what I was told at the college is that probably 30% of memories that come up under hypnosis are false. And so you can be sure 70% of it is real. But the problem is you don't know which is the 70% and which is the 30%. But at the same time, when you take somebody into a past life regression and you get to the point where you're entering a past life, it's not that I would say to them, okay, you're going to find yourself in ancient Egypt and you're going to be a man of medium status and you'll have some money and you'll have a wife and two kids. It's just a thing of saying, okay, you're in the past life. Where are you? And then you use very basic questions. You can't do any leading at all. And so you offer things. You might say, so are you in a new place now? Or is this the same one? Are you alone or are there people with you? So it's just kind of open. They can say whether they're with people or they're alone. And also I can see it being so emotional. It's quite often when I'm doing the Zoom calls and taking people through past life regressions that they're in tears. And I've had one guy, he got really upset and he was kind of screaming. There was a past life scene where his wife and child died, and he was, he was going screaming about how he couldn't save them. And what we usually do is to take them out of the emotion and take the person into a position where they can get the insights and the understanding of what happened in the past life, because that can be very healing. But you don't have to go through all these powerful emotions. And with that guy, I tried to take him out of it, and but he said to me, "No, no, I've got to experience this." So I helped him go through it. But there's all these techniques to move out of the emotion, so people don't get re-traumatized. Where I can say to somebody, "Okay, this isn't happening to you now. Now you're another person in the room and you're not emotionally affected, but you can still understand what's happening." Or I might say, okay, you're outside the room now and there's a big, strong, locked door with a little window in it and you can see what's happening, but you're protected. This big, strong door protects you from that. And so you get that understanding, and something seems to happen on a subconscious level. And I don't know if anybody can explain this, but a healing happens. And I've had people have physical healing, and I've had people have emotional healing. I've had, there was a guy who had terrible pains in his abdomen, and the doctors had done all the scans and checked him out, and they couldn't find any reason for this pain. And I took him into a past life, and I didn't tell him this was going to come up in the past life, but he got stabbed and it killed him. And he was stabbed in the abdomen. And we did a session 2 weeks later, and he was saying, the pain's decreased by about 50%. I can't believe it. I sit in front of the TV, poking myself in the belly, testing it because the pain's decreased. And there was a lady who she came to me for a past life regression for something else, not for what happened. She had eczema on her leg and she was in her 50s and she tried everything throughout her life to get rid of it. And in the past life regression, we were in a forest and she stood in a bear trap. And, those big metal claws come up and they grabbed her leg. And that happened to grab her leg exactly where her eczema is. And she emailed me a few weeks later and said the eczema's gone. It's completely disappeared. She'd never been able to do that her whole life. And just the other day, somebody wanted to work on their relationship with their parents. And they emailed me to say that they went to see their parents a couple of days ago. And it's the first time in many years that they've been able to go in there and not feel so negative and not feel like they just didn't want to be there. There was some happiness there and positivity. And that's only come up after we worked through this past life where she had a relationship with them that was really bad in the past life. So something subconscious happens. It's a thing where I can guide somebody through a past life and we can try and target the cause of what is happening in this life. And I used to help people stop smoking with hypnosis. And we'd be in the same room together and we'd finish the session and they'd get up and leave. They wouldn't feel any different. But then weeks or months later, they email me and they say, I've not had one cigarette since that session. And they didn't notice a change in themselves. It was on the subconscious level. And it wasn't that they had more willpower and they wanted a cigarette but didn't do it. The idea of having a cigarette was completely removed. It just didn't even occur to them to have a cigarette. And that was a subconscious change. And I think we see that happening with past life regression and the way stuff comes through. It can be really powerful.
First of all, the smoking doesn't tie into past life in any way. That's a different type of hypnosis,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
And have there ever been brain scans done to see, like, it sounds like there might be changes in some neural pathways from this. I mean, this sounds so powerful. I'm curious at what type of brain scans might, if they have been done with past life regressions.
I know they've been done with people who've been hypnotized. They've done that a lot. And there was something my tutor at college would say is that when they study the brain while it's hypnotized, they can find nothing that you would call hypnosis. There's nothing they can point to because you have alpha waves and beta waves, don't you? And theta, and they couldn't say, "Oh, that's it. That's where the hypnosis is." Because when I've been hypnotized, and I've been hypnotized a lot, it just feels like some great relaxation. And but I think that there have been brain scans done on mediums while they're doing mediumship, where something's been seen, but not while somebody's going through a past life regression. That's interesting, actually. Yeah, I haven't thought of that. It would be great if you could do that. You could try and find somebody who had the equipment to study it.
I have so many ideas for experiments, and they all cost a lot of money, and there isn't that much money for this kind of research. So, yeah, one thing that I thought was really interesting that you brought up was the physical components and how people actually healed physically. And that makes me think of, I mean, so much of this must tie into physical because, the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson showing, if there's anything you want to add to this, I'll give a brief, explanation that children, they would discover wounds on young children sometimes who had past life memories, and the wounds would correspond to how they passed away in a previous life. And you could say, well, maybe they want to make up a story around a birthmark, but some of it was not seen. For example, a boy had, well, he had a small like birthmark on his forehead that was seen, but then he had a birthmark on the back of his head covered by hair that no one could see. And he had memories of being shot in the head in his previous life. And the two birthmarks corresponded with the path a bullet would take with the exact way he had memories of being shot. So to me, that's immediately what I thought of when you said the physical. That our past lives seem to imprint in some way on the development of our bodies.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting that that those birthmarks would come up, birth deformities and other things, and you wonder if it's something energetic that's imprinting upon the physical, the fetus or the small baby while it's still in the womb and bringing these things through. And it also makes me think it might be a mistake. And I don't know about you, but I've always thought that like the spirit world would probably be perfection. They don't make mistakes. But if that's the case, then maybe the birthmark, whatever's coming through for the new child, is supposed to be there for some reason.
I don't think the spirit world doesn't make mistakes. Like, if I don't know, but my guess now, I would guess, is it's just other forms and dimensions of consciousness. I mean, right now we happen to be in a form and a dimension of consciousness in these bodies, in this planet, in this time. And I wouldn't see discarnate consciousness as being significantly superior. And maybe some are, there are probably levels that are, but often in the way like a 40-year-old would know a lot more than a 2-year-old. And if, a 40-year-old or even a 20-year-old was sent back to the twos in nursery school, they would be a genius if they were,
Yeah.
if they weren't in an adult body, but if somehow their body went to a 2-year-old, they would be absolutely a genius intellectually, emotionally. But as we all know, 40, 50, 60, 70, even 90-year-olds are far from perfect with a lot of issues. So that's kind of how I've always pictured it. And maybe some of them have mastered the physical world. This one, I don't know. I mean, I guess I've never thought of spirit world as having a form of perfection. But I only
Yeah.
started to think about the spirit world a few years ago. I never would have considered it as something real. So I've been digesting bits and bits of the probability of discarnate consciousness.
Yeah, because I talked to Dr. Yvonne Cason about one of her near death experiences. And she said that after the point where she died and she went onto this spiritual space, she was just there by herself. And then two spiritual beings turned up and they said, "Oh, sorry, we're late. We didn't know you were coming." And there was this talk I've heard of people have near-death experiences in India have a slightly different experience to us in the West because they don't have Christianity there, and they have this. Some of them have said that they've died and they've gone into this other place, and somebody's there with a book, and they said, "Oh, sorry, we've made a mistake. We want somebody who's got the same name as you, but we picked you up by accident, so you can go back, and we'll go and get the other guy."
That's hilarious.
I know it's
Doesn't shock me. I mean, it shocks me in the sense that we survive death shocks me every time I get evidence, but the fact that that would happen seems more realistic to me than perfection.
yeah. It almost sounds like a Disney movie or something. But
It does.
I've got a book here. Here we are. Have you got this book?
Yes, it's called Where Reincarnation, for everyone who's just listening and not seeing the video, Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect by Dr. Ian Stevenson. Yes, I have it in a Kindle, so I didn't visually recognize the cover right away. But
Yeah,
that's
and
one amongst the first books that I read in when my dad was still in hospice, I believe. So
yeah, and this is going to go out on audio, isn't it? So people can't see this video.
So I will put a clip to this video on YouTube, on my website, WTF Just Happened, under the link for this episode, and I will also post it on Instagram.
There's like this autopsy picture showing the bullet entering and exiting the guy's head, and the birthmarks are in the same place. But there's another one here but there's this other one with this boy from Burma who is so different to his family, and he remembers the life as a pilot in the Second World War, where they were flying over Burma supporting British troops that were fighting Japanese. And this is the picture of him. Oh, there we are. And you can see how he's with Dr. Ian Stevenson's interpreter, and he should be ethnically the same skin color, but he's got blonde hair, blue eyes, and much lighter skin.
I
And
think we should have a conversation with his mom.
and so he
I'm
remembers
joking, but
yeah, he remembers that life as an American bomber pilot that was shot down over that area of Burma. And it's almost like he was reincarnated where he died, which is another weird concept. I wouldn't have thought that would have to be the thing.
it makes me think. I mean, there's got to be just ways this just works without a grand plan. But I also think, like, if you have traumas in this life, there's that book that a lot of people have read, The Body Keeps Score. You have emotional traumas, they manifest physically, and often you'll go to therapy and you might be having stomach aches and headaches, and a lot of those are from anxiety and stress, and you make changes in your life and the physical ailments go away. Not always, but that's part of it. So it would make sense if you're carrying over a shock and a trauma, I mean, horrible
Yeah,
things like you're murdered unexpectedly and you're young. And this stuff, consciousness, creation of all types of consciousness in different states, doesn't work flawlessly. You might just, think how you act in shock. I mean, I remember as pieces of it, not all of it, like the day we got the call, my dad was in the hospital. It's like you sort of go into this different state. So you have this, what I would imagine be one of the most profound shocks. You're murdered, you're in a car accident, you're young. You might just jump into a fetus. We don't yet know how all this works, and you're bringing the traumas and shocks that are embedded in some way. I mean, it it doesn't seem outlandish.
yeah. The mind's so powerful, isn't it? If we just look at the placebo effect when they're doing testing with drugs, and the people who get the placebo have perhaps even better healing than the ones that are taking the real drugs. And it's just that your mind believes you're getting some medicine, and the body repairs itself.
I mean, that's a whole other topic. That might be some of the stuff I start researching next. I find it so interesting. So you've had psychic flashes yourself that have been confirmed. I'd love to hear about that. Then we'll transition into a ton of stuff I want to talk to you about UFOs and other planets.
Well, it's weird talking about other planets, because I had this weird thing that happened last night. I was watching, the Picard series, and there's a point where uh, one of the characters asks another one to give a toast. They're all standing there with their glasses. They can have a toast. And straight away in my mind, I thought of a limerick that would be a really silly and funny toast to make, which goes like this. It's there was a young lady from Ealing, and then the character on TV says, there was a young lady from Ealing of making a joke toast. And that was in my mind 10 seconds before it was on the TV. And you think, where does that come from? But another thing was, this was years ago. I was, what was it, 1999? I was going to my friend's wedding in New Zealand. I'd never been to New Zealand before. And they said, could I bring them a present from London, just something really cheap and awful? So I got them a tea towel with the map of the London Underground on it. And I was walking through the centre of London. And then suddenly I had this vision, I don't know why, for 30 seconds, where I was sitting next to my friend in their car in New Zealand, and they were driving us through suburban Christchurch. And I saw the names of the streets and the houses, and we're having this conversation. And then it just stopped. And so 2 weeks later, I'm in Christchurch in New Zealand, and that happened exactly as I'd seen it. And it was 30 seconds of time, and I'd never been to Christchurch. I didn't know what suburban Christchurch looked like. I didn't know the road names. We're having exactly the same conversation. And I've talked to somebody about this, and they said, oh, yeah, it's just deja vu. But deja vu doesn't last 30 seconds and doesn't have that detail and give you that imagery that you couldn't possibly know like 2 weeks beforehand. And so that was another psychic flash. It's like I'll get things now and then. I have no control over it, and the information is pretty much useless, except to like tell me that something's going on. And it might be like it's being given to me by, say, spirit guides. They're trying to nudge me along a spiritual path with these tiny little steps, and it's like every now and then it's somebody called it a spiritual kick up the arse. They're moving you forward. They're giving you something to make you realize that the physicality of life isn't all there is.
It makes me think of what you just said. You gave a very much more intense, exaggerated version of how this all seems to work. Probably people experience it much more extreme at moments, or certain people do more. But the studies by Dr. Daryl Bem and Dr. Dean Radin about how we have physiological responses to events a few seconds before they're supposed to happen. Like, if we're shown, they did lab experiments where they showed people emotionally neutral images, emotionally provocative images, both wonderful and terrible. And one version of it, they were testing people's emotional reactions, and the physiological responses were, I believe, a few seconds before the images showed up, and they matched the emotions of the images. And so that's got to be some way the world works. And sometimes, and with some people, it probably is much more intense than others, and much stronger in terms of experiencing the future. But it certainly makes me question how time works. It's got, I mean, it just, everything, our experience of time, that's not possible, but it happens. It's that line, I believe, by Dr. Ian Stevenson. I'm not saying it's true, I'm just saying it happened. Or by Martin Caidin, as Lloyd Arbach always says, this shouldn't be happening, but it is, So
Yeah, yeah. And there was another experiment where they sat somebody at a table and they put a video camera behind them, and then somebody in another room could see them on the video monitor. But they said, well, look away, watch some TV, read a book, and every now and then look at them through the video monitor. And the person in the room had to write down the time where they felt like somebody was watching them. And they had this, they call it statistically significant, that they would write about how many times they were being watched through the video camera. And it's that thing that we all get, that, don't we? That feeling of being watched. or that feeling when maybe you'll go into a room with a couple of friends and maybe they're a couple and they say, "Hey, how you doing?" It's all smiles, but there's an atmosphere. You know they've been arguing, but you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't. It's not like you heard them arguing. You just get a sense of it, and I think we can all pick up on those things sometimes.
And isn't that study, that was the sense of being stared at by Dr. Rupert Sheldrake? Am I right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah. I read so much stuff, I lose track of it.
Me too. Me too. I feel that was one of the things I learned early, and I have my strongest memories for the early stuff because it was every line I was reading. So I decided to divide my talk with Simon Bown into 2 episodes. As he mentioned in the intro, he has 2 podcasts. One is called the Past Lives podcast, which I was really excited to also be a guest on. And he talks about afterlife evidence. And his other podcast is the Alien UFO podcast. So we have a conversation that you just heard now about afterlife evidence, and then we get into UFOs. So it made sense to divide this into 2 episodes and 2 completely different topics. So join us next week for the rest of my talk with Simon Bow. Where can our listeners find you? Listen to both of your podcasts, have a past life regression with you. Let us know.
Well, my website is pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. And on there, there's a booking page. And when you go through to that, you can book a free consultation call on Zoom. So it's free of charge, and we can chat about doing a past life regression. Some people want to do it for therapy. Some people just want to explore, just see what comes up. And I've got the Past Lives podcast, which comes out every Monday, and then another episode on the Thursday, which is when I read from an extract of the book, like I did with your book. And then there's the Alien UFO podcast, which also comes out every Monday. And I got them onto as many podcast apps as I can. So they should be pretty easy to find.
And all those links will be in the show notes. So thank you so much, Simon.
And thank you. It's been really good.
To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, What the Fuck Just Happened? A Sciencey-Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. And you can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife. You can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can also read about how much I harassed them trying to get evidence, see if they were cheating, and see if they were sane. There, you can subscribe to our newsletter. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hi, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_ or email me at hello@WTFJustHappened.net. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder what the fuck just happened.